Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Huri Amir. Today we are going to learn about flexor reflex and withdrawal reflexes as well as crossed extension. Now let's talk about them one by one. First of all, let's talk about the flexor reflex. In the spinal or decerebrate animal, almost any type of cutaneous sensory stimulus from a limb, if that is there, the flexor muscles of the limb, they actually contract. And it is actually to withdraw the limb from the stimulating object. The pinprick, heat, or a wound, they are all going to lead to flexor reflex. That is the stimulus which leads to the contraction of the flexor muscles of the limb to withdraw from that stimulus, and it is known as nociceptive reflex or simply a pain reflex. So flexor reflex is actually a sort of one of the pain reflex is one of the examples of the flexor reflex. Then we have another term, that is withdrawal reflex. What is withdrawal reflex? Withdrawal reflex is the stimulation of one part of the body, that is withdrawal from the stimulus. Many patterns of these reflexes are there in different areas of the body. Then we have the neuronal mechanism of the flexor reflex. The neuronal mechanism is that a painful stimulus is applied to hand. As a result, the flexor muscles of upper arm, they become excited and going to lead to withdrawal of the hand from the painful stimulus. You can see what are the pathways which are leading to flexor reflex and what are the pathways which are leading to the crossed extensor reflex. You can see that there is presence of reciprocal inhibition. Now the first point is that there is a thumbtack producing a burst of firing in the sensory neurons. Now this is going to lead to the burst of firing in the sensory neurons exciting the excitatory spinal interneurons that excite the biceps motor neurons. At the same time, there is the burst of firing in the sensory neurons exciting the inhibitory spinal interneurons that inhibits the triceps motor neurons, leading to the simultaneous contraction of biceps muscles and relaxation of triceps muscles, causing a rapid flexion of the elbow joint. The pathways for eliciting the flexor reflex, they pass first the spinal cord, interneuron pool of neurons, and then to the motor neurons. Most signals of the reflex involve the following basic types of circuits. These are of three types of circuits, which are diverging circuits, reciprocal inhibition circuits, after discharge circuits. Diverging circuits. They spread the reflex to the necessary muscles for withdrawal. Then the reciprocal inhibition circuits. They inhibit the antagonist muscles. After discharge circuits, they are going to last many fractions of a second after the stimulus is over. Within a few milliseconds after a pain nerve begins to be stimulated, the flexor response appears. In the next few seconds, fatigue occurs. Finally, after the stimulus is over, contraction of the muscle returns towards the baseline. The after discharge results from both types of repetitive discharge circuits, which are continuous intrinsic neuronal discharge, continuous reverberatory circuits. Now, electrophysiological studies, they do show that there is immediate after discharge, there is prolonged after discharge. Now, what is immediate after discharge? That is going to occur like 6 to 8 meters per second, resulting from repetitive firing of the excited interneurons themselves. Then there is presence of prolonged after discharge, which occurs after strong pain from recurrent pathways, and they initiate oscillation in reverberating interneuron circuits. Now, what is the pattern of withdrawal? A painful stimulus on the inward side of the arm elicits not only contraction of the flexor muscles of the arm, but also contraction of abductor muscles to pull the arm outward. What is a crossed extensor reflex? About 0.2 to 0.5 seconds after a stimulus elicits a flexor reflex in one limb, the opposite limb begins to extend. This is the crossed extensor reflex. You can see over one side there is flexor reflex taking place, on the other limb there is crossed extensor reflex taking place. So we can say that reciprocal inhibition occurs. Now, neuronal mechanism of the crossed extensor reflex. Signals from sensory nerves, they cross to the opposite side of the cord to excite the extensor muscles. Why? Because the crossed extensor reflex usually does not begin until 200 to 500 milliseconds after onset of the initial pain stimulus. Many interneurons are involved in the circuit between the incoming sensory neuron and the motor neurons of the opposite side of the cord responsible for the crossed extension. Now, what is the function of crossed extensor reflex? About to step with right leg, there is a painful stimulus. Then the right step over there on the stimulus. Then the right leg begins to flex and the left leg begins to extend. Then right leg fully flexed and left leg is extended, and the last you can see only afterward do you notice the pain. Now, after the painful stimulus is removed, the crossed extensor reflex has an even longer period of after discharge than does the flexor reflex. It is presumed that this prolonged after discharge results from reverberating circuits among the interneuronal cells. The prolonged after discharge is of benefit in holding the pained area of the body away from the painful object until other nervous reactions cause the entire body to move away. You can see the longer duration of after discharge. Now, reciprocal inhibition and reciprocal innervation. A reciprocal inhibition Now, when a stretch reflex excites one muscle, simultaneously it is going to inhibit the antagonist muscles. A reciprocal inhibition, neuronal circuit that causes this reciprocal relation, that when one muscle is reflexing, the other muscle is relaxing at the same time, is called reciprocal innervation. Reciprocal relation exists between the muscles on the two sides of the body, the flexor reflexes and extensor muscle reflexes. A moderate but prolonged flexor reflex is elicited from one limb of the body. While this reflex is still being elicited, a stronger flexor reflex is elicited in the limb on the opposite side of the body. This strong reflex sends reciprocal inhibitory signals to first limb and depress its degree of flexion. Finally, there is removal of the stronger reflex and it allows the original reflex to reassume its previous intensity. You can see duration of inhibitory stimulus. Now, reflexes of posture and locomotion. What are the reflexes for? Reflexes for posture and locomotion. Postural and locomotive reflexes of quad. Positive supportive reaction. Pressure on the footpad of a decerebrate animal, it causes the limb to extend against the pressure applied to foot. This reflex is so strong that if an animal whose spinal cord has been transected for several months is placed on its feet, the reflex often stiffens the limbs sufficiently to support the weight of the body, and this is positive supportive reaction. The positive supportive reaction involves a complex circuit in the interneurons similar to the circuits responsible for the flexor and crossed extensor reflexes. The locus of the pressure on the pad of the foot determines the direction in which the limb will extend. Pressure on one side causes extension in that side. Magnet reaction, which prevents an animal from falling to that side. Then we have the cord righting reflex. When a spinal animal is laid on its side, it will make uncoordinated movements trying to raise itself to the standing position. This is the cord righting reflex. Complex reflexes associated with posture are integrated in the spinal cord. Stepping and walking movements, rhythmical stepping movements of a single limb. When the lumbar portion of spinal cord is separated from the remainder of the cord and a longitudinal section is made down the center of the cord to block neuronal connections between the two sides of the cord and between the two limbs, each hind limb can still perform individual stepping functions. Forward flexion of the limb is followed a second or so later by backward extension. Then flexion occurs again, and the cycle is repeated over and over. What is stumble reflex? The sensory signals from the foot pads and from the position sensors around the joints play a strong role in controlling foot pressure and frequency of stepping when the foot is allowed to walk along a surface. If the top of the foot encounters an obstruction during forward thrust, it will stop temporarily. Then in rapid sequence, the foot will be lifted higher and proceed forward to be placed over the obstruction. This is the stumble reflex. Reciprocal stepping of opposite limbs. If the lumbar spinal cord is not split down its center, every time stepping occurs in the forward direction in one limb, the opposite limb ordinarily moves backward. This effect results from reciprocal innervation between the two limbs. Then we have another term, that is mark time reflex. Diagonal stepping of all four limbs. If a well-heeled spinal animal with spinal transection in the neck above forelimb area of the cord is held up from the floor and its legs are allowed to dangle, the stretch on the limbs occasionally elicits stepping reflexes which involve all the four limbs. In general, the stepping occurs diagonally between the forelimbs and hind limbs. This diagonal response is another manifestation of reciprocal innervation. This time occurring the entire distance up and down the cord between the forelimbs and hind limbs is known as the mark time reflex. Then there is a galloping reflex in which the both forelimbs move backward in unison while both hind limbs move forward.